Welcome back to Compensation Matters. I'm your host, Deanna Romanowski. So, at this point, we're all hearing about AI, what it could do, what it might do, what it should do. But in the middle of all this hype, it's hard to get a clear view of what's actually here and what's just around the corner. Today's guest, Yuki Cheung, is here to help us sort this out. With a rich background in robotics, psychology, business administration, and tons of hands on experience, both as an SPM admin and a consultant, she's been closely tracking how generative AI is quietly transforming the SPM platforms. In this conversation, she walks us through 5 areas where real change is already underway and what it means for the people doing the work. Yuki, thank you for being here and welcome to the show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me here.
So, before we dig in, you have a really unique background. How did you go from engineering to psychology to comp strategy and tech consulting?
So, I have a background in mechatronics engineering and psychology, and also an MBA in strategy and marketing. I've always been passionate about technology. I started building websites when I was 11, but throughout all of that, there was one focus at its core, and that was people. A lot of people were wondering, how would you marry engineering with psychology? But in my mind, it just made perfect sense. And when you put technology, people, and business together, well, naturally, this is where we land on business systems tools, and specifically SPM, sales performance, and also compensation is a field that really marries all these topics very well.
Yeah, it feels like you basically reverse engineered your way into becoming the perfect SPM thinker inadvertently.
I'd like you to come into this space. It's very, very interesting and I love it here.
When it comes to AI and SPM, how did you come up with the 5 areas to look at?
Right. So what I've done is I've reviewed the marketing materials and some of the presentations and tradings of the top in-demand SPM platforms out there. I've reviewed most of the publicly available items, but also some private ones and some seminars, etc. And I summarize what I've seen into these five main categories. So the five categories are implementation and changes. So AI can make implementation and logic changes a lot easier. It can do instant documentation or near instant documentation. It can crunch reporting and data analysis very, very easily. It can do forecasting and what if scenarios, even to people without a stat background. And finally, it can do
Mhm.
benchmark.
Let's take these one by one, starting with leaner implementations. What do you think is changing? How will it work? How can people use it?
So essentially, what the Gen AI would do for implementation changes that you would be able to build logic by entering prompts. So entering in text what you needed to do. So you can be very specific, but then you can get to a point, and I think the ideal is to get to a point where you can tell it to just read through this comp plan PDF file and just build the logic for it. Of course, being in the space, I don't think we'll quite get there, but if it can build pieces of logic, and with simple prompts and reduce work that traditionally takes, let's say, 8 hours to 4, that's 2 times faster already. So it's huge. The future that I see in this is that, okay, well, instead of a 2-year implementation, we can maybe expect, maybe a 2-month implementation. And that is a huge win for organizations that have pretty frequent comp plan changes. There's a lot of exceptions that happen. Sometimes decisions are made after the fiscal year already started, and then you need a few more months to then implement these changes. That is actually one of the top headaches for people in the SPM and compensation field. So these little tweaks that originally took 3 months, now it can be done in 3 days. That I think is a huge win to everybody involved.
There was a Forrester study that was released recently about how plans need to be reviewed and analyzed a lot more frequently. Traditionally, it was done once a year because of the tech that was available, but now that these things are moving much faster, they're actually recommending that this get done more frequently. So it's interesting to think about implementation not as a bottleneck, but as a bridge to strategy, especially as organizations start to iterate more frequently.
That's right. Everything is moving so fast nowadays, and you got to keep up.
So next up, we have AI generated documentation. In our previous conversation, you mentioned that Gen AI might actually make system documentation in some ways obsolete. How do you think businesses will respond?
So what's interesting is that the marketing material from the platforms actually advocate for instant documentation and faster documentation. You can actually ask it to generate like a user guide for an entire line of business, clarifying which items you need to work on a daily or monthly or annual basis. You can get that to generate that guide for you. But I would question, if you can get instant information, why would you need to come back to a PDF or Word document, right? You can just ask directly, well, which are the elements or the objects that I need to update before cutoff on a monthly basis? And it'll generate that list for you instantly. And any changes that happens to the logic, to your model gets instantly reflected. So documentation in itself, I believe, is going to get obsolete. Now, it is an organizational requirement for a lot of audit checklists, but I think those will change very quickly. It'll ask, can your tool generate, information immediately about the model? And if your checkbox is a yes, then you don't need documentation. It's how I envision future, organizational processes to be.
Yeah, I can imagine that if somebody has to dig through a 40-page system doc just to get an answer on something, it could be a huge relief to not have to do that. But it would all depend on the accuracy and reliability of that data, of course.
Yes, that's right. And I'm glad you asked this question. Gen AI is still in its infant stages. Right now, we know that it's not quite there yet. One of the first signs of it is that every time you ask the same question, it gives you a different answer. When it comes to documentation, every time you ask, it can give you a different style of documentation that can be trained. And I know that that's something that the platforms have been working on to make sure that at least the stylistic aspect of it is consistent. But at the end of the day, things are different every time you ask. So how reliable is it, and how can we, generate trust in it? It also depends on the way you prompt. If you forget to mention some details, it can miss a lot of the information that you need. And so that is something that will require a lot of discussion.
And we have the concept of AI hallucinations where they every once in a while feel like being more compelling or quirky and, you know, put in new information. So
That's right.
rise of
And
your
that
recipe.
actually, yeah, that actually leads us to the reporting and data analysis
Mhm.
piece. Because, well, documentation is one thing. You can ask, a few times in different ways if you are not getting the information you need. But when it comes to reporting and data, sometimes very important decisions are being made on the insights it generates. Let's say one of the analysis that I've done before, not with AI, manually in the previous analytics task, is that we compare the profits generate the bottom line of the company versus the total compensation to individual reps. And we found that it was not necessarily correlated. The people who were getting paid the most did not generate the most profit for the firm. Insights like that, you can ask Gen AI to crunch those numbers for you, and you may make decisions on that. But what if the results are actually not accurate because you missed something in the prompt, or because there was something wrong in the methodology? And methodology is something that is very, very, very important in the field of stats in general. Right now, when people are crunching these numbers, they usually get some kind of peer review. So you can be rather comfortable that there's a couple of pair of eyes that make sure the approach is of coming up with these results is more or less reliable. With Gen AI, it's a bit of a black box. It just comes up with you right away. You can ask it to, show all the steps to get there. That is something you can do, but means, that means that you now need more qualified experts. Not more, actually. You need one more qualified expert to review it because if the business user don't have that background, then it can get pretty dangerous.
But
Yeah,
the alternative, of course, is more than one qualified expert, presumably. So either way, there's still scale and improvement and optimization that's made possible if you do it right.
for sure.
Yeah.
So let's say if Gen AI can do the work of 10 junior data science experts in very short time, and right before you make any, decisions on it, you get it checked by, the principal data science expert, that already shrinks, the cost of the firm considerably.
Yeah. And it's
Mhm.
interesting to think about data as not something that you have to just read, but something that you can be, in a way, in dialogue with, where you can dynamically ask a questions, drill deeper into something, analyze it a little bit further. So if we can get to a point where we can trust the results, like unquestionably, it would be a pretty brilliant and amazing change, transformative change.
That's right. Data science is really a science and an art. It's funny to say this, and this art part really is about coming up with creative ways to marry different types of data. You can ask it to come up with ideas, but it still will require this piece of oversight and creativity from humans.
Yeah, I feel like it's an art until we have better data, more reliable data, and a better way to process it. And then the more that we take steps towards that future, the more it becomes more of a science. But yeah,
Right.
for sure, it's definitely still an art.
Mhm. So when it comes to reporting, that's where the interesting conversation comes up. Right now, how organizations do it is they usually have a reporting team, and every month they would generate certain reports for the business users. So monthly, quarterly reports, annual reports. It's an operations team. Now, in the future, if you can generate these reports instantly, what is going to happen to, well, first of all, these teams, yes, but these reports as a whole that you generate on the recurring basis? And the thing is, again, we come back to the point that every time you put in a prompt, the results are going to be slightly different. That is a huge concern. So it's a huge problem if you need to consider the element of time. So you need to compare last month's results to current month's result. You want to put them side by side. If the methodology again is different, you cannot. So those will stay as reports. So if you're in that field, don't worry, you're still going to be around. But there will be conversations where, hey, this report is only used, once every couple of years by this one person, a very usually very high up person. That's why we still do it. But every time we generate it, we need to put it up to date, right? That's a pretty common task to do in the world of reporting operations. Well, that will go away because if you can generate the report instantly with Gen AI and it can take into consideration all the latest updates and newest data available, etc., then all of those one-offs, those ad hoc reports, for example, could go away. So that will be a new conversations that hires have to have when Gen AI will be widely available.
And just one of the areas that it systemically will restructure how we organize around all these new systems.
That's right.
Yeah. So does that lead us into forecasting and the what ifs?
Yes, absolutely.
Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so forecasting and what ifs is a big element, mostly on the strategist side, not so much on the operations, right? A lot of decisions are made based on, how much, first of all, how is it going to drive behavior of the sales folks, but also how much that is going to impact the organization in terms of costs, usually. And there's very complex forecasting that are being done right now. SPM tools often gets used for that. But the work is pretty huge. Like to have to build a test environment or some sandbox environment for you to bring in all of the data. You average the data out from the past X number of years so that you can have like a proper forecast. And then maybe add like another 5-10% if you're changing certain things. And then you're changing like all these different variables, and then you're asking, okay, how is it going to look like? That is a lot of work. It's very complex work. And this work is potentially going to be done very easily in the future with Gen AI. You can ask, hey, how much Paul would have made in each compensation segment if the commission rate was this for product A, this for product B, this for C, bonus changes in this way, etc. And to generate this what if scenario, take the average of the past 3 years that he brought in. And if you can get that done in very little time, that's huge because you can imagine leaders don't just want to run one what if scenario or one forecast. They want to compare they can run maybe like 10 different scenarios and then just to decide what they want to actually implement. So being able to do this very quickly is going to be invaluable for their decision making.
Yeah, and as these systems evolve, I imagine they'll get even more sophisticated in the factors what they consider. So it wouldn't just be basic math, but it would factor in like some Pareto principles or something that is more of like a human element where, in an organization, when you have a certain scale, certain top performers outperform by a certain percentage reliably over others. So it can make a much more comprehensive analysis overall.
Yeah, and that's a very, very interesting, input because yes, actually with Gen AI, you are not limited to your own data based on
Really?
the recent happenings of the world. Like, what is the outlook? How would that possibly impact? What is the industry's general consensus on that? And incorporate that in the forecast. Of course, leaders know these things by instinct. They know they're in it every day, but to be able to do it via like data and technology and confirm their gut feeling what's right would be, I think, very, very valuable.
And you can even have a conversation with the assistant to figure out what it is that you should be factoring in. You can ask, how are the market conditions changing? What's actually going on outside of our internal data set? What should I be considering when I'm predicting all these things or making these estimations? So the whole task can be quite interesting going
That's
forward.
right. Yeah. So once you generate something, it will ask you, well, here's a different way that I could generate it for you. Would you be interested in that? And yeah, a lot of times those are very, very good suggestions. So the breadth of information or of, complex data that you have access to or get insights on is going to be a lot bigger. Of course, with information overload will create what we call analysis paralysis. Like, which analysis are you going to go with? So, again, I really feel that human beings are still going to be around. It's just the nature of the work is just going to be slightly different.
I think that brings us to the next point, the final point. To solve paralysis, one of the things that you can do is use external benchmarks. And that is one of the things that's also going to be impacted by by AI and SPM. Can you walk us through a little bit of that?
Yeah, so benchmarking is used more, I guess, on the strategy side. And the world is gonna be your cocoon. You can ask anything about the data that's available out there. It will be, I think, an interesting challenge. You come up with the different questions that you can ask that would be relevant to the decision that you need to make. And I think that is the skill of the future, like knowing what questions to ask. Because really, you're going to have access to so much information that may or may not help your decision.
Yeah. It's like
Yeah.
having a research assistant that never sleeps, but you still have to be the editor in chief to make their insights meaningful.
That's right. So currently there may be a team of analysts that scours the internet and puts together presentations and summarizes things. And the good thing is when you have analysts, they usually will tell you, hey, these are the points of consideration, or these are kind of the pieces that you may be need to be aware of. With Gen AI, that is not so transparent. So again, having judgment when using
Right.
tools are going to be important. The other question about benchmarking, though, is as let's say a sales rep, I use this tool and I ask, what is the average output that I can expect? This could drive some gaming behaviors. The more powerful tool you have, the more you may be gaming the system. So on the comp side or on the strategist sides, you have the same tools. So it'll be an interesting race already happening in today's world, but it'll be faster and more powerful to have to, detect these behaviors, I think.
Right, that's a brilliant point because if the people that are designing the comp plans are trying to outpace the people that are trying to game the system, it's they end up,
Mhm.
as you say, in a race.
Yeah, that's right. So it'll be very interesting how this breadth of information is gonna drive different behaviors for different groups of people. Not only for business admins who are trying to
Mhm.
do their work easier, but also for the users themselves.
Yeah. I imagine that what might end up happening at some organizations is they might end up limiting the kind of prompts or the kind of data that some users have access to so that they can't reverse engineer some of the ways to optimize that aren't good for the business.
Right. And that's already being implemented, in existing tools like ChatGPT, Copilot, etc. There's still creative ways to get
Mhm.
around that. You can, download the data and crunch it elsewhere. It's going to be very interesting on the governance side of things.
Right. Let's drill in on what this means for people working in comp admin, the an analysts, the sales ops, the administrators. What skills should they be sharpening to stay ahead of all of this?
Right. So there was a very interesting comment that was made in the Accelerator conference. So they had said AI may not be replacing people, at least not anytime soon, but
Mhm.
people with AI are going to be replacing people without AI.
I just
That
wanna add, what's
right.
interesting is this is not a new quote, it's from Gary Kasparov once upon a time back when he beat and was beaten by an AI in chess, and I think that's
Oh,
fascinating, yeah.
that's very interesting. And I think people need to keep that in mind.
Mhm,
You don't need to be an expert in AI. In this episode, we didn't talk about the technicalities of how AI works, and that's on purpose because day to day, everybody in the day to day is going to use AI in the future, even if you don't have a background in the technology. What I think will be a basic skill that everybody will need to know is prompt engineering. I think a lot of people think, okay, this is going to be like a new job. I don't think so. I think it's just going to be kind of like basic Excel, basic SQL, SQL, which are currently taught in like accounting and other unrelated fields already, right? So AI prompt engineering is going to be a basic skill, and understanding how you need to shape the prompts to get what you need. There's also stats fluency and understanding of the different data science techniques. Again, you don't need to be a mathematician to crunch the numbers, but you should get familiarized with what if scenario. Well, there are different types of methodologies, Monte Carlo being one of the top ones. There are different methods to do regression analysis. All of those will be options in the AI tools. And so when it's asking you, okay, which one do you want to pick? You should be familiarized on the pros and cons at the very least. Then I think there's going to be a lot of discussions on the governance aspect. So again, who should have access to what? What are the dangers of letting people who should not have access to certain information have access to certain things, how to limit those for different groups. It is already happening. Like data access, user access is a talking point in the current world already. But in the future, we're likely going to be moving almost entirely onto data lakes instead of structured data warehouses. And so
Mhm.
these things become a lot more complex. So, yes, so from the management governance side of things, there's a lot of work there. And just in general, like keep an open mind, keep, reviewing the latest technology. You don't have to proactively, read about all the technical jargon, but just observe what your peers are doing. If there's any way that they're doing certain things smarter, like just pick up on them. That's always recommended for everyone out there. And technology is not supposed to be scary. If technology is hard to learn, that's the technology's problem. And so usually it should be made to be easy. And if you just take that little bit of effort to pick it up, then you're going to be so far ahead from everyone else.
Yeah, I think the cultural aspect of this is quite poignant because if there's so much change happening, people who are receptive to it and who are open to having the conversations, asking the questions, clicking through the manuals, they're going to do quite a lot better when
That's
the dust
right.
settles. Yeah.
That's right. So I think we should all keep a positive aspect to it because
Mhm.
your job's going to get easier, not harder.
Yep. So, Yuki, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and for walking us through all the changes that are on our doorstep. There's a lot to take in and a lot to be excited about. And I'm sure I, like all of our guests, are looking forward to how all this unfolds.
Yes, that's right. Actually, in our next episode, I'm going to be presenting some day to day tasks that you guys might be doing. I'll try to pick some of the hardest, most boring, most, difficult tasks and how Gen AI can help you do them a lot easier and a lot faster. So stay tuned to that.
I'm really excited about this one.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being here.